In 1998, 3 women left a rural Montana convent at 9:15 in the morning. Their destination was a churchyard sale, 11 miles west on State Route 200. The sign-out log showed their names in careful script. The car keys hung on the same brass hook they always did, except now the hook was empty. 21 years later, a park ranger found a waterproof bag half buried in mud near Flathead Lake. Inside was a small notebook. 3 names, a timestamp reading 10:03 a.m., and one handwritten sentence that made no sense: road closed, but map doesn't show it. The drive should have taken 14 minutes. Somehow it took 48, and then it took everything else. The convent sat 9 miles east of a town called Paradise, 67 residents, 1 post office, a general store that doubled as the only place to buy fuel for 30 miles in any direction. The 3 women who left that morning had lived there for a combined 41 years. They knew the roads. They knew the weather. They knew how to drive in snow, in rain, in the kind of wind that bent fence posts. The oldest was 62. The youngest was 34. The third was 48, and had grown up in the area. Her family still farmed 2 counties over. She'd driven State Route 200 more times than anyone could count. The yard sale they were heading to had been organized by a church in a neighboring parish. Donated goods, baked items, small household tools. It was listed in the parish bulletin. The date was June 6th. The start time was 10 o'clock. A local shopkeeper saw their car pass the general store at 9:20 a.m. He remembered because he'd just opened the cash register and glanced up. The car was a 1994 sedan, light blue with a small dent in the rear passenger side panel. The dent had been there for 2 years, result of a minor parking lot incident that no one had bothered to repair. Another driver, heading east, passed them near mile marker 81. He noted the time because he was running late for a meeting in Missoula. His dashboard clock read 9:28. The sedan was moving at a normal speed. No erratic driving, no visible damage. Nothing that suggested trouble. That was the last confirmed sighting. The yard sale began on schedule. A volunteer checked the sign-in sheet throughout the morning. By 11 o'clock, more than 30 people had arrived. None of them were the 3 women from the convent. By noon, someone from the host church called the convent. The person who answered said the women had left hours ago, should have arrived by 10. The church volunteer said they never showed up. At 1:15 p.m., a local deputy drove the route. He checked the turnoffs. He stopped at the few houses along the way and asked if anyone had seen a light blue sedan. No one had. He noted the weather: clear, dry, visibility over 10 miles. No road closures, no construction, no accidents reported. The search expanded. By late afternoon, a dozen volunteers were checking side roads, dirt paths, and access points to private land. A helicopter from the county sheriff's office flew the corridor twice. The pilot saw nothing unusual. No vehicle, no skid marks, no debris. The car's registration led to a records check. No toll booth activity. No fuel purchases after the ones made 3 days earlier. The convent's phone records showed no outgoing calls that morning. The women hadn't carried a mobile phone. Policy at the convent discouraged personal devices. 3 days into the search, a farmer 11 miles south of the route found a road flare in his irrigation ditch. It hadn't been fired. The safety cap was still on. The brand matched the type sold at the general store in Paradise, but the store hadn't sold any flares in over a month. The flare was bagged and logged. No fingerprints were recoverable. Water damage had degraded the surface. A week passed, then 2, then a month. The case file thickened. Witness statements, ethereal photos, soil samples from pull-offs along the highway. Nothing pointed to where the women had gone. The notebook found by the ranger in 2019 changed that. The ranger's name was Elliot. He'd been surveying erosion patterns along the north shore of Flathead Lake, an area where spring runoff often exposed objects buried in sediment. The waterproof bag was wedged between two rocks, about 40 feet from the current waterline. The bag itself was a commercial dry sack, the kind used by kayakers. It showed significant wear, but had remained sealed. Inside was the notebook. 60 pages, spiral bound. The cover was faded, but still intact. The first 12 pages contained handwritten notes, grocery lists, appointment reminders, a recipe for bread, ordinary things. Page 13 was different. 3 names were written in the same hand that had filled the earlier pages. Beneath the names, a date, June 6, 1998. Then the timestamp, 10:03 a.m. Then the sentence about the road. The handwriting matched samples provided by the convent. It belonged to the youngest of the 3 women. The timestamp alone created a problem. If the women had left at 9:15, and the destination was only 11 miles away, they should have arrived no later than 9:30. Yet, at 10:03, 33 minutes after they were supposed to be at the yard sale, someone was writing in a notebook about a road closure. Elliot photographed the notebook and filed a report. The original case file was retrieved from county archives. A forensic document examiner confirmed the handwriting. The ink was analyzed. Standard ballpoint, consistent with pens commonly available in 1998. The paper showed water exposure but no tampering. The next step was to determine where the notebook had entered the water. Flathead Lake is large, over 200 square miles. Maximum depth exceeds 300 feet. Currents are influenced by wind, inflow from the Flathead River, and seasonal temperature changes. An object entering the water at one point could travel miles before settling. A hydrologist reviewed weather and water data from June 1998. Runoff that year had been moderate. No major storms in early June. The currents near the North Shore typically moved southwest. If the notebook had been in the water since 1998, it likely entered somewhere to the northeast. That area included several access roads and a defunct logging trail that hadn't been maintained in over a decade. The trail connected to a network of older routes that predated the current highway system. Some of those routes were no longer on standard maps. A search team returned to the area. They focused on a 5-mile stretch where the old trail ran parallel to a creek that fed into the lake. Visibility was difficult. Dense underbrush, uneven terrain, and areas where mud remained soft even in summer. On the 3rd day, a volunteer found a tire track. It was faint, heavily eroded, but the tread pattern was still visible in a section of hardened clay. A forensic tire analyst compared the pattern to known makes and models from the 1990s. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to the type of tire that would have been standard on a 1994 sedan. 50 yards further along the trail, another volunteer found a fragment of blue paint on a tree branch. The branch was at the height of a car's side mirror. The paint was tested. The color and chemical composition matched the factory paint used on the missing vehicle. The trail dead-ended at the creek. The water was shallow near the mouth, less than 3 feet deep, but deepened rapidly as it approached the lake. Divers were called in. The first dive turned up nothing. The second dive conducted closer to the lake, located a debris field, sections of rusted metal, shards of glass, a license plate, heavily corroded, but with enough digits intact to confirm a match. The vehicle had been there for more than 2 decades. The condition of the wreckage suggested the car had entered the water with significant force. The front end was compressed. The roof was partially collapsed. The frame had settled into the lake bed at an angle, nose down, with the rear slightly elevated. Divers documented the scene before any recovery began. Measurements were taken. Photographs captured every angle. The interior was filled with silt, but several objects were visible once the sediment was carefully removed. A pair of eyeglasses, still in the driver's side footwell, a cloth bag on the rear seat, containing a small wooden cross and a set of rosary beads. A road map, waterlogged, but still folded, wedged under the passenger seat. The map was retrieved and allowed to dry under controlled conditions. Once stable, it was unfolded, Someone had marked it with a red pen, a circle around an area northeast of the highway, a small X near the old logging trail, and a single word written in the margin: detour. There had been no official detour on June 6, 1998. State records confirmed it. The highway department had no planned closures, no construction projects, no road work of any kind on State Route 200 that day. But someone had told the women there was. Investigators reviewed old incident reports from the surrounding counties. They found 3 other cases, all within a 2-year span around 1998, where drivers reported being waved off the main highway by individuals claiming there was a road closure ahead. In each case, the drivers were directed onto secondary roads. 2 of those drivers turned around after a short distance and returned to the highway. The third continued, and eventually found his way back to the main route, though he reported the detour added nearly an hour to his trip. None of those drivers reported seeing any actual road closure, no signs, no barriers, no construction equipment. Interviews were conducted with residents who lived near the old logging trail in 1998. Most had moved away. A few remained. One man recalled seeing a car that matched the description on a morning in early June. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. People occasionally used the trail to access fishing spots along the creek. He didn't see the car leave. Another resident remembered something else. A truck parked near the trailhead around the same period. The truck had been there intermittently over several weeks. It had a toolbox in the bed and a CB radio antenna. The resident assumed it belonged to a contractor or surveyor. He never saw the driver clearly, and the truck stopped appearing sometime in mid-June. The timeline began to sharpen. The women left at 9:15. They were seen passing through town at 9:20. They were headed west on State Route 200, a route they knew well, somewhere between mile marker 81, where they were last seen by another driver at 9:28, and the yard sale 11 miles further. Someone intercepted them. Someone convinced them the road was closed. Someone directed them onto a trail that led to the water. By 10:03, one of them was writing in a notebook. The road closed, but map doesn't show it. They were confused. They were trying to make sense of what they'd been told. The forensic team examined the vehicle's braking system. The brake pads showed no signs of having been engaged at the time of impact with the water. The steering column was intact, but the wheel was angled sharply to the right. The gear shift was in drive. The evidence suggested the car had gone off the trail at speed, without the driver attempting to stop. Either the driver had lost control, or something had forced the vehicle forward. A soil analyst studied samples from the trail near the point where the car left the road. Tire marks indicated sudden acceleration. There were no skid marks, no signs of braking. But there was something else, a second set of tracks, larger, wider, consistent with a truck. The tracks overlapped in places, suggesting the truck had been close behind the sedan. A reconstruction specialist reviewed all the data. He concluded the sedan had been forced off the trail. Not directly, there was no evidence of collision, but by following too closely, possibly with headlights on, possibly accelerating at key moments to prevent the driver from slowing down. The technique was known. The 3 women had been driven into the creek. The water carried the car downstream. It reached the lake. It sank. No one saw it happen. No one heard anything. The trail was isolated. The nearest house was over a mile away. The notebook survived because it had been sealed in the waterproof bag. Why it was in a waterproof bag remains unclear. Perhaps one of the women carried it as a precaution. Some people do, especially when traveling in rural areas. Perhaps it was grabbed in a moment of panic, shoved into the bag and tossed from the car before it went under. The bag surfaced eventually, drifted and settled where Elliot found it years later. The investigation refocused on identifying the individual or individuals who had staged the fake detour. Archived records from the highway department were pulled. Employee lists, contractor logs, vehicle registrations for trucks matching the description from witness accounts. One name appeared multiple times. A man who had worked intermittently as a contractor for various highway projects in the region. His truck matched the general description. He had no fixed address, moved frequently, and had a history of minor offenses, trespassing, petty theft, filing false reports. Records showed he had been employed on 3 separate occasions between 1996 and 1998 by different contractors hired by the Montana Department of Transportation. His role was listed as equipment operator and flagman. He would have been familiar with the procedures for setting up detours. He would have known what signs to use, what language to employ, how to make a diversion look legitimate. His employment ended in May 1998. The termination was marked as voluntary, but a supervisor's note attached to the file mentioned an incident where the man had been found using a company vehicle during off hours. No formal charges were filed. He returned the vehicle and left. Phone records from the contractor's office showed multiple calls to a number registered to a payphone near the general store in Paradise. The calls occurred in late May and early June. One call lasted 7 minutes, another lasted 11. The payphone was removed in 2003 when the booth was decommissioned. No recording of those conversations existed. Investigators cross-referenced the contractor's work schedule with the dates of the other reported fake detours. 2 of the 3 incidents occurred on days when he was not logged as working. The third occurred on a Sunday. His schedule showed he had no assignment that day. A pattern emerged. The detours always happened on rural stretches, always involved drivers unfamiliar with alternate routes, always directed people onto trails or secondary roads that led to isolated areas. In the 2 cases where drivers turned around quickly, nothing further happened. In the third case, the driver continued for miles before finding his way back. He reported losing nearly an hour. He also reported feeling watched. The women from the convent had no reason to question a detour. They were cautious drivers. They followed rules. If someone in what appeared to be work clothing flagged them down and told them the road ahead was closed, they would have believed it. They would have followed the directions given. A handwriting analyst reviewed the note on the map found in the submerged vehicle. The word detour was not written in the same hand as the other marks. The red pen used for the circle and the X was standard. The pen used for the word detour was different. Thicker line, slightly different ink composition. Someone else had written that word. Someone had marked the map to make it look like the detour was planned, like it was official. The analyst concluded the map had been altered after the women received it, possibly handed to them by the individual directing them off the highway. A small touch that added credibility. A piece of paper with markings that suggested authority. The man had left Montana in late 1998. Records showed he'd moved to Idaho, then Nevada, then dropped off the grid. As of 2019, his whereabouts were unknown. An alert was issued. Law enforcement in surrounding states were notified. His last known photograph, taken from a driver's license issued in 1997, was circulated. A deeper search into his background revealed 2 prior incidents in other states. In 1994, he had been questioned in connection with a stranded motorist case in Wyoming. A driver reported being waved off Interstate 25 by someone claiming there was an accident ahead. The driver followed the detour and ended up on a Forest Service road. His vehicle became stuck. It took him 6 hours to hike back to the highway. No accident was ever confirmed. The man questioned matched the general description, but was released due to lack of evidence. In 1996, a similar event occurred in Idaho. A family traveling through rural terrain was directed onto a logging road by someone they described as wearing a reflective vest and holding a stop sign. The family drove for nearly 30 minutes before realizing the road was leading them in the wrong direction. They turned around. When they returned to the highway, the individual was gone. The stop sign was later found discarded in a ditch 2 miles away. It had been stolen from a county maintenance yard 3 weeks earlier. Neither case resulted in charges. The descriptions were vague. No one had taken a photograph. No vehicle information was recorded. The incidents were filed as minor disturbances. But the pattern was there. And now, with the Montana case, the pattern had turned fatal. In 2020, a tip came in from a motel clerk in northern Nevada. A man matching the description had stayed there for 3 nights. He'd paid cash. He'd asked about routes heading north. The clerk remembered him because he'd complained about a noise in his truck, a CB radio that wouldn't stop picking up static. By the time officers arrived, the man was gone. The room had been cleaned. No evidence remained. The truck was not located. A follow-up tip emerged 3 months later. A ranger in southern Oregon reported an encounter with a man who had been camping illegally on Forest Service land. The ranger had issued a warning. The man packed his camp quickly and left. The ranger noted the truck, older model, faded paint, toolbox in the bed. The ranger had taken down a partial license plate. The plate came back registered to a vehicle reported sold in 1999. The trail went cold again. The forensic team working the Montana case returned to the recovered vehicle for a final inspection. They focused on the interior, searching for any overlooked detail. In the glove compartment, beneath the registration and insurance papers, they found a small folded receipt. It was from the general store in Paradise. Dated June 6, 1998. Time stamped at 8:47 a.m. The receipt showed a purchase of bottled water and a package of tissues. The total was $3.12. Payment was made in cash. The register tape included a notation, a handwritten initial at the bottom, indicating the clerk who had processed the sale. That clerk was interviewed again. He'd been questioned in 1998, but remembered little. This time, with the receipt in hand, he focused. He recalled the transaction. The women had stopped briefly. They'd been cheerful. One of them had asked if the route to the church sale was clearly marked. The clerk had said yes. Straight shot west on 200. Can't miss it. Then he remembered something else. A man had been in the store at the same time, standing near the back, looking at a road atlas. The clerk hadn't paid much attention. People often stopped to check directions, but he remembered the man had left just after the women did, and he'd driven out heading the same direction. The clerk couldn't describe the man in detail. Average height, work clothes. Nothing distinctive, but the timing aligned. The final piece came from a librarian in a town 60 miles south of Paradise. In 2021, while digitizing old records, she found a visitor log from June 1998. The library had required all visitors to sign in, a policy that had since been discontinued. One entry, dated June 4th, showed a name that matched the contractor. The purpose of visit was listed as research. The library's collection included historical maps of the region, topographical surveys, old logging routes, Forest Service documents. Someone looking to familiarize themselves with remote trails would have found everything they needed. Investigators requested the log. The handwriting was compared to samples from the contractor's employment records. It was a match. He had been preparing. He had studied the terrain. He had identified routes that would lead people away from help. He had practiced the detour scenario on other drivers. And on June 6, 1998, he had put it all into action. The motive remained unclear. Financial gain seemed unlikely. Nothing was taken from the victims. The vehicle was left in the water. No robbery. No theft. Some investigators believed it was about control, about the ability to manipulate people into making decisions that led to their harm. Others thought it might have been anger directed at authority, at institutions, at people he perceived as having more stability than he did. A psychological profile was developed. It described an individual with a need for dominance expressed through deception, someone who derived satisfaction from orchestrating events, from watching people follow instructions that led them into danger. The profile noted that such individuals often escalated over time, starting with minor disruptions and moving toward more serious harm. The 3 women had been victims of that escalation. They had trusted what they were told. They had followed directions. They had driven down a trail that ended in water, and for 21 years, no one knew. The case remains open. The 3 women were returned to their families. Services were held. The convent placed a memorial in the chapel, a simple plaque with 3 names and a single line. They traveled in faith. The families of the 3 women gathered for the memorial service in late 2019. More than 200 people attended, former members of the convent, parishioners from surrounding churches, volunteers who had searched in 1998. They came to remember, they came to acknowledge what had been unknown for so long. The youngest woman's sister spoke briefly. She described her sibling as someone who believed in the goodness of others, someone who never questioned a request for help, someone who would have stopped if asked, who would have listened if directed. That trust, she said, was not a weakness. It was a reflection of how her sister lived, and it was what someone had exploited. The families asked for the notebook to be returned. Once the investigation concluded, investigators agreed, but explained it might be years before the case moved to a stage where evidence could be released. Until then, it remained in the locker. Page 13 remained the most referenced entry in the file. The discovery of the vehicle brought some measure of closure, but it also opened new questions. Investigators began re-examining other missing person cases from the same time period. They focused on rural areas, on individuals who had disappeared while traveling familiar routes, on incidents where vehicles were never found. 3 additional cases drew attention. In 1997, a man traveling alone through eastern Montana disappeared after stopping for fuel. His last known location was a small gas station 40 miles from Paradise. He told the attendant he was heading north. His truck was never located. No body was ever recovered. The case went cold within months. In 2000, 2 college students driving from Washington to Minnesota vanished somewhere in western Montana. Their route would have taken them through the same general region. Their vehicle was found 3 years later, partially submerged in a reservoir 80 miles from the highway. The cause of the diversion was never determined. No witnesses came forward. In 2002, an elderly couple disappeared while driving to visit family in Idaho. They were last seen at a rest area on Interstate 90. Their car was discovered 6 months later in a ravine off a Forest Service road. The road was not on their planned route. There was no clear explanation for why they had left the interstate. Each case shared similarities: rural locations, routes that should have been straightforward, vehicles found far from where they should have been, and in each case, no clear cause for the detour. Investigators reopened the files. They compared dates, locations, and circumstances. They looked for overlaps with the contractor's known whereabouts. His employment records showed he had been in Montana during the 1997 disappearance. He had been in the area during the 2000 incident. The 2002 case occurred after he had left the state, but phone records showed he had made multiple calls to Montana numbers that year. The connections were circumstantial. No direct evidence linked him to the other disappearances, but the patterns were too similar to ignore. The task force expanded. Detectives from multiple counties coordinated. They reached out to law enforcement in Idaho, Wyoming, and Nevada. They shared information. They built timelines. A witness from the 2000 case was re-interviewed. She had been traveling the same highway the day the 2 students disappeared. She recalled seeing a truck parked on the shoulder near mile marker 127. A man had been standing beside it, holding what looked like a reflective vest. She hadn't stopped. She assumed he was a road worker taking a break. When she passed the same spot an hour later on her return trip, the truck was gone. She was shown the contractor's photograph. She studied it for several minutes. She said it was possible. The man she'd seen had been wearing a hat and sunglasses. She couldn't be certain, but the build was similar. The posture was familiar. Another lead emerged from a Forest Service employee who had worked in the region during the late 1990s. He remembered encountering a man on a remote trail in the summer of 1999. The man had claimed he was scouting locations for a documentary about abandoned logging routes. The employee had thought it odd. Documentaries usually involved crews and equipment. This man was alone. He had a camera but no other gear. The employee noted the encounter in his daily log but didn't pursue it further. The log was retrieved. The date was July 18, 1999. The location was a trail system that connected to the same network where the women's vehicle had been found. The description of the man matched the contractor. Investigators visited the trail. They brought cadaver dogs. The dogs alerted in 2 locations. Excavation revealed no human remains, but soil samples showed traces consistent with decomposition. The traces were old. Testing suggested they were at least 15 years old, possibly older. The material was too degraded to yield DNA. The findings were inconclusive but troubling. They indicated that something had been buried there. Whether it was related to the missing persons cases remained unknown. The forensic team working the Montana case conducted one final review of the women's vehicle. They used ground-penetrating radar to scan the lake bed around the wreck site. The scan revealed an anomaly 30 feet from the vehicle. A dense object, roughly the size of a toolbox, buried in sediment. Divers returned. They excavated carefully. The object was a metal toolbox, heavily corroded. The lock had rusted through. Inside were tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, a hammer. Also inside was a laminated card. The lamination had protected it from complete deterioration. It was an ID badge, the type used by contractors working on state projects. The photo was faded but recognizable. It matched the contractor. The badge had expired in May 1998. He should have returned it when his employment ended. Instead, it had ended up in a toolbox at the bottom of a lake. Investigators theorized he had used the badge to add legitimacy to his fake detours. Flashing an ID, even an expired one, would have been enough to convince most people he had authority. It was a small detail, but it was the kind of detail that made deception work. The case file grew thicker. Evidence mounted, but without locating the individual, no charges could be filed. The investigation remained active. Tips continued to come in. Sightings were reported. None led to an arrest. In 2022, a hiker in northern Idaho found a campsite that had been abandoned in a hurry. A tent was still standing. Food supplies were scattered. A truck was parked nearby, partially hidden by brush. The license plate had been removed. The registration was gone, but the VIN number was intact. The truck was traced. It had been reported sold in 1999, the same truck linked to the contractor. The buyer's name was fake. The address was a vacant lot. The sale had been a cover. He'd been driving the truck for more than 2 decades. The truck was impounded. Forensic teams processed it. They found fingerprints, hair samples, fibbers. DNA was extracted and run through databases. It matched samples taken from the toolbox recovered from the lake. The campsite was searched. Investigators found a duffel bag containing clothing, a few personal items, and a stack of maps. The maps were marked, circles, X's, notes in the margins. Each mark corresponded to a remote area. Some were in Montana, others in Idaho, Wyoming, Oregon. Investigators cross-referenced the marks with missing persons cases. 7 matched locations where individuals had disappeared or where vehicles had been found off expected routes. The dates ranged from 1996 to 2003. The evidence suggested a pattern that spanned years. A method refined over time, a predator who used trust and authority as tools. But the man himself remained missing. The campsite had been abandoned weeks before it was discovered. Footprints led away from the site and disappeared into rocky terrain. Search teams combed the area. Dogs tracked the scent for 2 miles before losing it at a creek. He had vanished again, just as he had done before. The notebook is stored in an evidence locker in Flathead County. Page 13 is still the most viewed entry in the case file. Investigators return to it when new leads emerge. They read the sentence about the road. They study the timestamp. They think about how 33 minutes became 21 years. The families continue to wait. They attend task force meetings. They review updates. They hold on to hope that someday there will be an arrest, that someday someone will face consequences for what was taken from them. The memorial at the convent remains in place. Fresh flowers appear on the plaque every week. No one knows who leaves them. The current members of the convent say they sometimes arrive early in the morning, other times late in the evening. Always quiet, always without announcement. The road was never closed, but someone wanted them to believe it was. State Route 200 runs quiet, now, the same as it did then. The old logging trail is harder to find. Brush has reclaimed most of it. The creek still feeds into the lake. The water is cold, even in summer. Rangers patrol the shore, watching for erosion, watching for what the lake gives back. Elliot still works the same routes. He checks the water line. He notes what surfaces. He files his reports. He thinks about the 3 women sometimes. He wonders if the lake is holding anything else. Other stories, other disappearances, other moments when a wrong turn became permanent. There are places where roads split off from the known routes, places where maps show nothing, places where someone might stand and wave you down, tell you there's trouble ahead, tell you to follow them. And by the time you realize the map doesn't match what you're seeing, you're already too far down a trail that doesn't lead anywhere you want to go. The lake doesn't answer questions, it just holds on to what it's given until weather and time pull something loose. A notebook, a tire, a fragment of a life that ended in water and confusion, and the terrible trust that someone pointing you in a new direction was telling you the truth. The 3 women left at 9:15 a.m. They were seen at 9:20. They were heading to a yard sale. They never arrived. And somewhere between the last sighting and the moment one of them wrote those final words, someone made sure they never would.